Attorney General Pam Bondi was sitting down on a podcast, and she used the term hate speech and saying that she was going to, the DOJ would go after people who were engaged in hate speech. That ignited a fury on the right because it's sort of a trigger word, even a phrase that Charlie Kirk, once said that, hate speech doesn't exist.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by Justice Department reporter Kaelan Deese. And Kaelan, you've written a story looking at the Biden administration's actions against a certain number of conservative groups while they were in office. What's the story there?
Yeah, so under former FBI Director Christopher Wray, there was a project operation that was started in 2022 called Arctic Frost that was largely believed at the time to simply be looking into former President Donald Trump and his claims and actions following and during this January 6th incident. And it was something that only up until recently, thanks to whistleblowers that came out, they were able to release records related to subpoenas to a litany of right-wing organizations and individuals, some of them being closely related to the president's inner circle around the time of 2020. You have Sidney Powell, John Eastman, but then you have these outlier groups like the RNC, Republican Attorney Generals Associations, and even Turning Point USA, the organization co-founded by Charlie Kirk, the late Charlie Kirk. And you see all of these, about 92 or so different groups, and it raises the question, why was the FBI looking into financial links of these organizations, especially ones that weren't necessarily touting the same things as Donald Trump, saying the election was rigged day in and day out. And it was an effort that wound up becoming sort of the basis for former special counsel Jack Smith's indictments into Donald Trump. But it still did appear now that we're seeing all these organizations like an extreme breach of privacy for organizations that didn't have any sort of alleged criminal wrongdoing or things like that. And it's become sort of a shock across the Senate. And thanks to the FBI under Kash Patel, this information was made clear this week.
So you mentioned the murder of Charlie Kirk, and the FBI, and to a lesser extent the Justice Department, have faced a certain amount of criticism of their handling of the investigation of his shooting, although there is a suspect in custody now. Have they weathered that, or is that still sort of ongoing?
So are you referring to the criticism that was initially maybe levied by certain people, things like that? Is that you're referencing?
Yeah, some people didn't like Director Patel's communications in the early going of the investigation, and then also Attorney General Pam Bondi had been criticized even by some supporters of the administration for referencing hate speech as something that might be prosecuted in connection to things like what happened to Charlie Kirk.
Yeah, it's a bit of a whirlwind because, starting from sort of where the initial criticism began to was burgeoning is in the hours after Kirk's assassination, we obviously saw the director come out and say that there was a subject responsible for the murder of Kirk that was in custody at the same time that local authorities were obviously saying that there was still a suspect at large. And so there was, some murmurs within the Trump administration that there was an attitude that was less than ideal. They were dissatisfied, some people, with that statement. But as the days that followed, there were statements that I received from people within the administration that it was less of a frustration, but it was more close to like an annoyance and just a hope that the suspect would be found. Sure enough, on Friday, last week, we did see the suspect in custody. Now there's 7 charges that Tyler Robinson is facing, and we're going to see potentially a death penalty trial. As for the criticism that continued this week, it was a conversation that Attorney General Pam Bondi was sitting down on a podcast, and she used the term hate speech and saying that she was going to the DOJ would go after people who were engaged in hate speech. That ignited a fury on the right because it's sort of a trigger word,
Sure.
even a phrase that Charlie Kirk, once said that hate speech doesn't exist. And it's true that under the statutes that we have in our books, that the idea of going after hate speech would be considered by many First Amendment advocates to be a chilling sort of exercise. And obviously, I think that the Attorney General has sort of clarified that she's referring to statutes that invoke inciting violence using speech as a directive. So it's something that I think that we don't really understand why she used that. It could have been sort of a political tactic to maybe give people some sort of serious impetus that we're not going to tolerate language that would incite violence. But it still was a bit of a black mark for her this week.
So finally, the Trump administration is taking its crime crackdown on the road, and the latest destination is going to be Memphis, sort of a blue city within a red state. State officials seem to be supportive of this, unlike in Chicago and Illinois. What can we expect?
Yeah, so I think that what we're already seeing is work being done by the FBI, over 500 arrests there in Memphis that Kash Patel was touting this week during his 2 congressional hearings, very fiery hearings. And the other thing that he mentioned that I found pretty interesting is that he is essentially laying out the fact that he wants what's going on in Memphis to take a page out of the DC crime crackdown. He's on the record saying that he does think that the National Guard is necessary despite pushback from local officials who think that it would maybe give Memphis a bad look or discourage people from visiting. But he thinks that the National Guard, as it did in DC, is important to lock down perimeters in areas that might be contain more criminal activity, because while the agents are there and doing their job effectively, if they're in an area that is known for being less safe, then Patel seems to believe that it's going to be more difficult for the agents to do their job. So the National Guard would not be assisting the FBI or other federal agents at all with arrests or things like that, but more so just being there as a show of force in a way to keep things safe. And he adamantly believes that the DC blueprint is something that should spread on to these cities wherever the Trump administration decides to go next, whether it's Chicago, so on.
Thank you, Kaelan. You can read Kaelan and the rest of our investigation team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.